I picked it up in the course of an article I was reading. But Balfour was a British philosopher and statesman of the latter part of last century and the first couple of decades of this one. Kind of a cynical observation, but probably more truth in it than not. If you have examined your schedule, you'll note that I'm talking on socialism this morning. And lest you have any uneasiness, I'm going to give you my conclusion now. I'm against it. Whenever socialism is seriously dissected and analyzed, there's an old figure of speech that comes to mind: a mailed fist in a velvet glove. Now, this is a rather harsh metaphor. I hasten to say that most socialists are reasonably well-intentioned men. Not very bright, but well-intentioned. But they've been had by about a century of their own propaganda. The socialists have outproduced us in this one field of propaganda or indoctrination by about 1,000,000 to 1. And so the present crop of socialists is a victim of their own snow job. They have been led to believe that only socialists desire justice between persons, that only socialists want to see other people well-fed, well-housed, and so on, that only socialists want peace between nations, and so on and so on. Well, people who believe this can believe anything. As a matter of fact, and by definition, every person of goodwill would like to see other people better off, better housed, better fed, better clothed, better educated, happier, healthier, with better medical care, and all the rest. So insofar as these are goals shared by us and socialists, then the only debate is over the means. What are the appropriate means we must embrace to achieve the ends of better housing, more food, healthier, happier people, and so on? The peculiar thing about the socialist, in other words, is not the goals he proclaims, although some of his proclaimed goals are utopian and in the nature of hallucinations. The unique thing about the socialist is his solution for the difficulties, his way of organizing society so as to bring about the ends he says he wants to reach. And so we ask, what are the imperatives of a socialist order? How do you structure a society if you want that to be a socialist society? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. They tell us again and again. They want the state or government to own and operate productive property. The state becomes the sole employer. As I mentioned yesterday, the state runs the factories, the mines, the banks, and so on. The state operates the churches, the schools, the newspapers, and all the rest. In a mature socialist society such as Russia or China, the state is virtually the sole employer. Again, there is leakage around the edges, but in theory, the state's the sole employer. Now, we've heard lamentations from liberals and socialists about a mythical condition in the little village of Punxsutawney where there was only one factory, where if this factory closes down, nobody has a job. Well, it's a mythical situation, but the cure for that, in their view, is to have only one employer for the whole nation. Now, this circumstance, that the livelihood of every person depends upon the state as an employer, will reduce a once independent citizenry to a servile status. For it is a truism, an ancient truism, that whosoever controls a person's livelihood has gained enormous leverage over every other aspect of that person's life as well. Your choice is to do your employer's bidding or quit, and in the case of a total state, you starve. You've read the Federalist Papers, and you realize that Alexander Hamilton, in two of his papers, quoted the old maxim that whoso controls a person's livelihood, or whoso controls a person's subsistence, controls that man's life. Socialism is a command economy. Society is ranked like an army, with orders coming from the top and trickling down to the layers below. There is regimentation and control dictated from the top down, and this is the mailed fist which the velvet glove would like to conceal. Let me nail down the point by quoting the mercurial Mr. George Bernard Shaw, who can be found on many sides of most issues over the years. But he was a long-time Fabian socialist, and in 1920, in the official publication, Labor Monthly, October 1920, he wrote, "Forced labor with death as the final penalty is the keystone of socialism," unquote. He offered this not in condemnation, but as a mere description. In short, the operational imperatives of a socialist order demand a regimented society, a command society, a coercive arrangement within which the lives and property of the many are controlled by the few who wield political power. The big question then is, why do so many otherwise sensitive, intelligent people find this scheme of things attractive? But the fact is, a lot of people find that scheme attractive. Everything about freedom seems so natural and so right to those who understand what a free society is that we can't help but wonder why so many people find the opposite persuasive. The 20th century, it's often been said, the 20th century, our time, faces left. Nation after nation succumbs to a communist, a Marxist ideology. And Marxism, whether of the Moscow or the Peking variety, becomes the official religion of hundreds of millions of people. Lots of other people in this country and elsewhere reject Marxism and its dogmas, but they embrace a progressive ideology or a liberal ideology. That is, they would advocate national planning, the state regulation of what they call key industries. They would advocate public works, welfarism, and so on. When you add up these millions who are behind the Iron Curtain as devout Marxists, plus those who are in other free nations as liberals or socialists, when you add up these millions, you ask yourself, is there anyone else? Who's left? Who's left that's right? And, as a matter of fact, there are some on our side of the fence. You have observed their books back there. There are people pretty firmly grounded in the traditions of 18th century Whiggism or 19th century liberalism, and they have written books to expound the political and economic doctrines that we associate with that tradition. There are some able scholars in this camp, Mises, Hayek, Friedman, many others, and their writings, seems to me, demolish collectivist theory. And they present solid, carefully reasoned, intellectual and moral arguments on behalf of the free society, free economy position. Now, the soundness of the position of these advocates of individual liberty and the free economy is attested even by its opponents. That is, by the feeble efforts they make to controvert it. Now, they're against it, of course, but rarely do they marshal reasoned arguments against it. Typically, the tactic of the left against the scholarly works of the right takes one or the other of four forms. The first tactic is to ignore it. I got a book yesterday by a professor of history at Yale, Professor Baumer, the intellectual, something like the history of ideas in the past 4 or 5 centuries. I checked for Mises and Hayek. On one page there is a reference to Mises. It simply says Mises, whose pupil Hayek wrote a book, The Road to Serfdom, in 1944, which had quite a following in this country and in Europe. Many other of our intellectual heroes are not mentioned in the index, and to give such economists as Menger, Björn, and certain others, no mention at all, certainly would appear to be a defect in a book of, say, 600 pages detailing the intellectual history of the West in the past several centuries. So typically, the left ignores the works of the right. That is, don't discuss it, pretend that human action or the Constitution of Liberty, for example, does not exist. The second line of defense is, if you can't ignore it, misstate the position and then knock down the straw man. The idea would be that a person who defends the free economy is simply a front man for the rich. And as soon as a person gets up in public and says capitalism is fine, the theory is that the wealthy will rush forward with their hands full of $1,000 bills in their haste to pay someone who's on their side. I've been waiting for this for about 25 years. It just doesn't happen. A third tactic is to call names. Useful epithets, of course, are reactionary, 18th century ideas, capitalist, outdated, or whatever. The fourth allegation is something like the one I just mentioned. The fourth one is allege hard-heartedness towards the plight of the poor. Well, this last charge is almost hilarious because you ask yourself, what other system, what other arrangement of society, other than the free economy or the capitalist arrangement, has succeeded in elevating more poor people further out of poverty faster? And none. Capitalism has not handed out things to the poor. It has made the so-called poor into members of the middle or upper classes by giving every person an opportunity and scope to apply his particular talents to a job. I often ask myself what amalgam of ignorance, malice, stupidity it takes to bring this charge against the free economy, that it neglects the poor. The record shows that the government handout system, in contrast to the free way of doing things, not only demeans the poor, but it keeps them in poverty. Well, the system of liberty has solid intellectual and moral foundations. Why then do not more people find our case persuasive? Why do so many people gravitate toward freedom's opposite and jostle each other as they crowd the road to serfdom? I've asked myself, is there some human trait which, when it is released from religious and moral controls, works on behalf of socialism and against the free society? And the answer is yes. Such a trait is envy, and its twin, covetousness. Our ancestors have dealt with these things for many, many centuries. We know they are unlovely facets of human nature, and hitherto only moral energy has kept them bottled up. But when this bottle is uncorked and they are released, they work against freedom and for socialism. Ask the well-known man in the street, what do you understand by socialism? And typically the answer is, well, socialism, it's a scheme for divvying up the wealth. It's a scheme which will soak the rich and give to the poor, and so on. Well, spellbinders of the left play upon these feelings of envy and covetousness with practiced skill and set person against person and group against group. These ugly traits of nature, human nature, have caused trouble for a long time. We find one of them in the Decalogue, thou shalt not covet. The moral theologians of the Middle Ages who were attempting to list the several traits of human nature which militated against the emergence of the human potential called them 7 deadly sins. One was envy, the other was covetousness. Our forebears sought to neutralize these destructive traits by making their control a religious duty. The thumbnail difference is you envy what a person is, you covet what he has. But if the egalitarian drive, which is back of socialism, is to gain momentum, then this drive needs the fuel which only envy and covetousness can supply. So socialists exploit the new morality whose propagandas tell people that they should covet their neighbor's goods. Roll your own 10 Commandments, and remember that there is an easier way of getting your hands on a buck than working for it. Divide the society into the haves and the have-nots, and then convince the have-nots that the reason they lack certain amenities of life is because the haves possess them. That is, if a man who earns $25,000 a year is the reason why somebody else earns only, say, $7,500. Well, with a part of ourselves, we would love to believe something like this. We would love to believe that the reason why we are not doing better is not our fault. We aren't to blame. It's this other fellow who is preventing us from doing as well as we should. A friend of mine says that he's not a paranoid, although there is a paranoid streak built into human nature itself. He's not a paranoid. As a fact, he says, it's the paranoids who are after him. And so many people are reluctant to utter a mea culpa in the case of their own failures and shortcomings. And we know that such sentiments as these are music to our ears, that it's his fault that we aren't doing better. But this attitude will not stand a moment under the scrutiny of a little bit of economic reasoning. We can learn from the science of economics, if we choose to learn from it, that the free economy is not like a zero-sum poker game where one man's loss is another man's gain. Bunch of men sit around the table. There are stacks of chips in front of all the players. As one player begins to win, his stack goes higher and higher, and the other player's stacks grow correspondingly shorter. In the marketplace, however, there is a progressive increase in the total number of chips, so to speak, available for every player. In a progressive economy, there is more for everyone. It is not simply a case of recutting the same old size pie. It is increasing the size of the pie with every productive cycle. Every man in the marketplace earns precisely what other people think his services or his goods are worth to them. And there's the rub, because every one of us knows that our services are worth a lot more than other people think they are. It's only experience and self-discipline that allows a reality sense, which we all do possess, to finally come to the fore and convince us, yes, this is the way it ought to be. This is the way, maybe it's a kind of a rough and ready way of divvying up the world's goods, but it is the best way available. However, economic understanding, the understanding that in the free market, your wages or your return is only what other people think your services are worth to them, this market way of doing things and reasonable considerations such as these have to be squelched by spellbinders of the left in order to inflame more acutely the envy of the have-nots. But this inflamed envy of the have-nots then has to be synthesized with the aroused guilt of the haves. Now, in previous ages, the haves did obtain their wealth by seizing it. The good old rule, the simple plan, that they should take who have the power and they should keep who can. This is the way it was in the pre-capitalistic ages, that is before the day of the free society and the free economy. the rulers and their friends use their power to seize the wealth produced by people. However, when men are free, when the society is free, then economic rewards are parceled out in a different manner. The free society, to repeat, allocates rewards in the marketplace. It rewards the man who best pleases consumers. And at this game of pleasing the customers, some people obviously are much better than others. To say it once again, every one of us, to the extent that the free economy operates, it doesn't operate 100%, obviously, today or any time, but to the extent that the free economy operates, in a free society, everyone is rewarded, materially rewarded, according to the value willing buyers attach to his offering of goods and services. Typically, even in today's sort of warped market economy, people don't ask you for your pedigree before they solicit your services. If they like the gizmo you manufacture, if they like it, they don't care what your background is, whether you're black or white or yellow or whatever. Now, this marketplace assessment of the value of the gizmo you manufacture is made by consumers, and everyone knows that consumers are neurotic, ignorant, stupid, misled by Madison Avenue, and so on. In other words, that people about like us. Now, this does, of course, seem to be a very clumsy way of deciding how much of this world's goods shall be placed at this man's disposal and how much at that man's disposal. Isn't there some neater way of going about this division of the rewards? Well, that question has been asked for thousands of years, I guess, and people came up with an answer, say, 2,400 years ago. In effect, they said, we will invite the wise and the good to come down from Olympus and to sit as a council among men. And we will individually appear before this council, one by one, to be judged according to our own merit. And then we will know that the fellow who gets $1 million deserves to be a millionaire. And the rest of us who have to live on a pittance deserve to be at that level, and we'll all be happy and contented. What nonsense. Because we all know that the genuinely wise and the good would never consent to sit on such a council. And I can give you the words of the wisest rejecting it. Who made me a judge over you? Well, obviously, this marketplace decision that some people are entitled to $25,000 a year and others only $7,500 a year, this decision is obviously not marked by supernal wisdom. No one ever claimed this, but it is about 1,000,000 light years ahead of the alternative, which is to convert consumers into an electorate, into voters, who will then elect a government, which will then appoint a bureaucracy, which will then decide by political legerdemain who gets how much of what. This mad scheme backs away from the difficult and crumbles into the impossible. Obviously, again, there are no perfect arrangements in human affairs, for the very simple reason that there are very few perfect people around. But the fairest distribution of material rewards available to fallible human beings is to let a man's customers decide how much he shall earn. This method will distribute economic goods unequally, but equitably. Now, a man's customers aren't simply the ones that come into his grocery store. I suppose my most immediate customer is Leonard Reed. My next level of customers are people like yourself or others that pick up and read the Freeman or audiences elsewhere. So if I all of a sudden went insane and joined the Socialist Party, I would have a different set of customers, presumably. But anyway, those who are the consumers of your goods and services are the ones who will decide what your services are worth. Now, this poses some difficulties within the bureaucracy, as you will gather if you will expose yourself to the pages of Mises' Bureaucracy. You've been reading about the unrest among the police in New York. Well, how do you price the services of a New York cop? Not on the market. Or the Memphis firemen have just gone back to work. No, not the Memphis, the Louisville firemen just signed a contract. The Memphis firemen are the ones who were setting fires about 10 days ago. Kind of a scary thought. But in a marketplace, we do have consumers of our goods and services, and it is they, in their hands, where the decision lays as to what reward we shall attain. Parenthetically, it should be emphasized that the market does not measure the true worth of a man or a woman. All of us have met millionaires who are bums and poor people who are genuine human beings. If we took it that the person who earns the most money is of the most genuine human worth, we'd have to say that those who make a bundle in 1978, such as television commentators, authors of bestsellers, writers of filthy books, producers of pornographic films, and so on, that these are among the best people. Well, they're not. To the contrary. But their presence in our midst is a rather cheap price to pay for the freedom we enjoy in the other sectors of our society. And so, in a free society, those who earn more than the national average, although they are not better people, are entitled to enjoy their possessions, for they've gained them in a system of voluntary exchange. And the chances are that they have conferred more enjoyment than they can possibly buy with $1 million. For example, suppose you invented the hula hoop. It took several thousand years after the invention of the wheel to invent the hula hoop, but we're slow learners on this list. Anyway, suppose you sold 1 million hula hoops and made $1 profit on each hoop. This would net you, let's see, $1 million. What I'm saying is that chances are that the millions of kids and others whirling inside one of your hoops are in sum total creating more enjoyment than you can possibly buy with $1 million you've earned. In other words, there are no valid reasons for a person who has done something like this for inflicting feelings of guilt upon himself. Although I would rather see a person, say, write a good book than to produce 1 million hula hoops. I would certainly grade human activities in other terms than the monetary reward that they gain. In the free society, there is genuine reciprocity. But of course the socialists and the liberals are blind to the mutuality which is a built-in feature of the free society. And the left will therefore make a determined effort to instill a guilty conscience in everyone who lives above the poverty level. And to this end they will employ Marx's exploitation theory, the surplus value idea. The surplus value idea of Marx is that the employee, no matter how good the employer is, will earn enough in, say, the first half of the day to return him what he gets in wages, but he won't then go home. He'll work all afternoon. That which he produces in the second part of the day will be garnished by his employer, so the capitalist exploits whether he wants to or not, whatever his ethical elevation might be. Well, this surplus value idea, or the exploitation theory, was demolished by Boudreaux in his book, which appeared in 1873, the very year that Karl Marx died. I don't know whether Marx read this, but in any event, he could have read it, or some of his followers might have read it. And you lucky people can read it because it is available as a booklet, a small book, excerpted from the larger Boudreaux Capital and Interest, the exploitation theory. Boudreaux did it again. That has demolished the surplus value idea in 1896 with a book called Karl Marx and the End of His System. Well, it wasn't quite the end, but anyway, good title. But this surplus value idea, even though it doesn't hold water intellectually, is still useful as propaganda, and so we hear it all the time. It is not only among individuals where this differential in wealth is exploited, because, as you know, there are have and have-not nations. The have-not nations are the nations to which the citizens of the USA have donated something like $500 billion worth of goods and services and interest since the end of World War II. Well, this enormous shipping of goods and services and people to other countries, of course, has earned us the gratitude of the world, where the peoples of other nations often rise up and call us blessed. In the eyes of most of the world, we still have too much. Now, the words vary, but the music is always the same, and you've heard it many times. Americans, who represent only 7% of the world's population, consume 20% of the world's food, use up, or as Mr. Carter would say, we waste 2/3 of the world's energy. We drive 75% of the world's automobiles. We sit glued to 75% of the world's television sets, and so on and so on. Now, I'm an amateur critic of the quality of life lived in America, and I would agree that Americans, by and large, do eat too much of the wrong kinds of food. We exercise too little. It do us a lot of good to leave the car in the garage and walk or ride a bicycle. And furthermore, I would insist that no mixture of excessive food, comfort, ease, gadgetry can ever be summed up into the idea of the good life. The good life is in some other dimension than this. Most persons would agree. But all this is merely by the way. The matter at issue here is not the desirability of a more Spartan or a more stoic lifestyle for the people of America. And incidentally, as you know, the Spartan lifestyle is not exactly practiced by the rich of Asia, Africa, Europe, or elsewhere. The biggest market for Rolls Royces at the present time, I have read, is in Africa. It's just that more people, a higher percentage of people in these 50 states of ours, are enabled by our system to enjoy more of this world's goods than all but a handful of people elsewhere, and thus we are conspicuous enough in our consumption habits to arouse the carefully cultured envy of the rest of the world. The question then is, should Americans deliberately lower their living standards? Well, as I say, there are probably some good arguments for a return to plain living, hard work, the Puritan ethic, thrift, saving, and so on. By the way, as far as saving is concerned, Americans are way down the list at the present time among the nations of the world. We're not saving and investing, which is part of the capitalist system, of course. So there are good reasons, good arguments on behalf of a more stoic lifestyle, but among the good arguments, deference to local liberals and the critics of the foreign nations are not among those good arguments. It's a fact that Americans do consume more than, on the average, the people of other nations. How come? The answer is clear. Americans consume more because Americans produce more. The people of India want to consume more, and God knows they need to. There are lots of Americans who have the knowledge to tell Indians how they can become more productive, who would go to India on their own time at their own expense to try to convince Indians that Indians can become a more productive society if they will accumulate capital at a faster rate than population growth. It's the abundance of capital per worker that makes the American worker productive, more productive than his counterpart elsewhere. The Indians work hard, harder than Americans, but they have almost no capital per worker, and so they produce little. In other words, productive efficiency requires, first of all, thrift, savings, investment in tools and capital and machinery if you want to have a more productive economy. And there must be institutional incentives for capital accumulation, such as a high regard for the sacredness of private property, an ethic which exalts honesty, thrift, hard work, the idea of inherent rights of every person, and so on. A nation which embraces these ideas is bound to prosper, as America once prospered. Now, suppose the American government continues to yield to pressure from the critics of foreign nations as well as the criticism of domestic liberals, and suppose the government increases the tax bite on American citizens so that Americans will consume less. In other words, suppose that a larger and larger amount of what American working people produce is siphoned off and the surplus shipped abroad to foreign nations. What will happen to production here when the people here are denied the enjoyment of the fruits of their productivity? Well, you know what will happen to it. Production will fall off. Production will decline in terms of the amount of production taken from those who are producing. Why does a person produce? He produces in order to consume. Now, I know that there are little hobbies and crafts. You don't carve an elephant from a cake of ivory soap for the sake of the ultimate product, but for the fun of, the work itself. But for the most part, you work and produce because otherwise you cannot honestly consume. Consumption is the end in view of all productive activity. If everything a person produces is taken from him, obviously he'll stop producing. If 50% is taken, he'll slow down. Inevitably, it follows that the very worst help we can give to foreign nations is to embrace or inflict policies upon ourselves which make us dollars poorer without at the same time making them a penny richer. This envy-guilt syndrome provides a very interesting glimpse into the socialist mentality. Socialists typically have little concern with production, with increasing the efficiency of production. Socialists are preoccupied with the political redistribution of the already produced stock of goods. But as we are aware, there is in fact only one way to make economic goods appear, and that is to apply human effort augmented by tools and machinery, which is capital, to raw materials with the resultant wealth. But the left has little interest in this process, but a lot of interest in taking from producers by taxation and distributing to consumers, assuming that production occurs automatically or by magic. Socialism has no program except to seize property from the haves and distribute the seized property to the have-nots. And the guaranteed end result of this is to enforce domestic poverty at home and to increase hunger around the globe. Now, when productive energy is unshackled, turned loose, then there's economic progress. As a result of economic progress, a society moves up from a situation where almost everyone is poor into a situation where the normal condition for the overwhelming multitudes of people is relative economic well-being. In other words, When you have the situation we have gained by, to some degree, unshackling production, we will have general prosperity shared by all but a few. There will be, in any prosperous society, unhappily, pockets of poverty. There will be Appalachias, there will be urban slums, and so on. And the contrast then between rich and poor makes every compassionate person want to do something to alleviate the sorry condition of those seemingly trapped in these pockets of poverty. And in many cases, indignation suggests a remedy which appears obvious to those who respond emotionally without thinking, which is to take from the haves and give to the have-nots. If some are better off than others, why, seize the property of those who are better off and pass it on to those in need. Not a very efficient procedure, by the way. It costs government more than $3 for every $1 it gives to the poor. Imagine a system of medicine where doctors diagnosing an illness seek to cure the sick by making the well ill. Now, this is about what you have, by analogy, in the economy. The healthy part of the economy is blamed for the sickness of the sick part of the economy, and we seek to cure the poverty part by making the prosperous part poor. This is madness. If this tactic were used in medicine, few patients would survive. Poverty cannot be relieved unless we know the cause of poverty. And this means we must also learn the cause of prosperity. For poverty can be overcome by increased productivity and in no other way. And so we ask, what is the recipe for material well-being in a nation? Answer is fairly simple. Prosperity in a given nation is generated by efficiency in production. And productive efficiency demands such things as a climate of freedom, security for property, the accumulation of capital, progressive technology, skillful management, and the like. It follows that any impairment of any one or more of these factors makes us poorer than we otherwise would be. And there are many such impairments resulting from unwise, unwarranted political interventions, such as progressive taxation, which hinders or even prevents the accumulations of saving with a resultant drop-off in investment. Compulsory unionism institutionalizes a certain percentage of unemployment and makes us in total poorer. Minimum wage laws disemploy a certain percentage of people, and we are that much poorer as a result. The unions impose a rigid wage structure. We might be in for wage and price controls. There is inflation, which is the result of government adding to the number of monetary units and so on. All of these political interventions make us poorer than we otherwise would be. They do the society immense harm and almost no one any good. And the catch is that those who are most severely injured by these interventions are the very poor these interventions are designed, allegedly, to help. The only sound strategy, if we are concerned about the poor, is to apply the formula for prosperity across the boards. And this means we must find some way to stop government from hurting people. If government would stop hurting people, it would not have this specious reason for its efforts to help them. Again, a bit of an aside. It is not enough for a nation to be merely prosperous. The good life, as I've said, lies in another dimension. A happy person is one who has found something to live for. He's found a way of life or a lifestyle that draws upon his potential, that develops his powers. Now, material well-being, that is food to nourish you, clothing to keep you warm, a place of shelter, material well-being is certainly a factor in the good life. But in our time, this one factor has come to loom so large that evidence of economic distress anywhere is all the excuse some people need to wreck the economy which has produced the general prosperity. What I'm saying is that justice is the first consideration in a society. If you read Adam Smith as far as page 623, you'll note that Adam Smith speaks of my liberal plan of liberty, equality, and justice. Three things which are the same, three facets of the same thing, seen from different perspectives. Justice is the first consideration in the society, and this means no legislation designed to give some people an advantage at the expense of other people. No arbitrary controls designed to put a damper on people who want to be more productive than the controls allow them. And then after justice, of course, charity. Charity, an attitude of mind or heart, issuing in philanthropy, which realizes that in any society there are some handicapped people who simply cannot cope. Now, the scope of private philanthropy is still enormous, even after 45 or so years of the welfare state, when it has been drilled into us that we now have a government with a heart which will take care of people, and therefore there is no need for private charity. Some of you may have seen the front page story in the New York Times 2 weeks ago Sunday about the hard knocks being given private philanthropy in different countries in Europe. Almost a sin, if not a crime, to set up systems of private charity in these welfarist countries. But in this country, the springs of compassion have not run dry, and they run much more freely, as we'd expect, in the private sector. Last year, the American public gave roughly $30 billion to charity. That is, to their schools, their churches, to the aid of handicapped people, whatever the disease might be. The situation as far as diseases is concerned led one comedian in Hollywood to say, because every disease has some Hollywood star who heads the honorary board, he says all the good diseases are spoken for. Well, still I would insist that the economic way of going about the alleviation of poverty is not by philanthropy, but by work in the productive sector of the economy. Take an example. Here is John Doe, who at age 25 went to work in this country in 1935, retiring at age 65 in 1975. Let's assume that John Doe was a productive fellow, a machinist. Let's assume that the society, the nation, was at peace during this period, as has been for some people's lifetimes in this country. John Doe earned enough from 1935 to 1975 to put in the bank every year $1,000. Not inconceivable. He was soaked by taxation, found more than $1,000 every year. He put $1,000 in his bank account. He began paying into Social Security shortly after he began to work. He is, as a result, several $1,000s poorer. John Doe was hit by a variety of taxes, from income taxes on down to local sales taxes, during the whole course of his productive life, and he is tens of thousands of dollars poorer in consequence of what he was taxed. Because of the government's welfare program, the government inflated the currency. And so what John Doe was paying for his goods and services in 1935 was a mere fraction of what he was forced to pay in 1965. Consult, for example, a 1939 Sears Roebuck catalog and drool at the prices. So in effect, the inflated prices of the things John Doe had to buy was in effect another tax on John Doe, who was, again, thousands of dollars poorer as a result. Okay, John Doe retires at age 65 in 1975. Now the government with a heart which has been doing all this to John Doe for the past 40 years, promises to take care of John Doe until his death. How? By sending him monthly a check whose dollars each one is worth less and less month by month. This is how government takes care of the poor. Whereas if John Doe had been allowed to save $1,000 a year, and this was compounded semi-annually at 6%, he would have a nest egg at age 65 of $243,000. Came across an article in, of all places, the New York Times Magazine, just about 2 years ago, by Thomas Sowell. Some of you know the name Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is an economist, PhD, University of Chicago. He's out at UCLA and the Hoover Institution at the present time. Happens to be black, and he happens to be one of the clearest thinkers I know. He has an article in the New York Times Magazine on welfarism. I'll quote you a passage. To be blunt, the poor are a gold mine. By the time they are studied, advised, experimented with, and administered, the poor have helped many a middle-class liberal to achieve affluence with government money. The total amount of money the government spends on its, quote, anti-poverty, unquote, efforts is 3 times what would be required to lift every man, woman, and child in America above the poverty line simply by sending the money to the poor. Well, there's no doubt in my mind that envy and covetousness play an enormous role in socialism's advance. Socialist society, to say it once more, demands a regimented people. There are the few who give orders, there are the many who must obey. On the other hand, by contrast, the free society not only tolerates individual differences, it encourages each person to contribute his own unique talents to make up the total richness. However, we live in the age of mass man, the age of conformism, and there are strong social pressures on every one of us to be just like everybody else. And so the advocate of the free society is bound to rub a lot of people the wrong way. I've often thought that here I am trying to advance the idea of a free society, but I have to, in all honesty, tell the people I'm trying to sell on the idea that once we have it, they won't like it. I won't like a lot of what happens when people are free. Because when people are free, a lot of them are going to act in ways you don't like. If we say we believe in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, religious liberty, and freedom of economic enterprise, we know by embracing these freedoms that some people will say and put into print things we think are harmful or silly or stupid. In religion, when people are free, they will believe things that we think ought to be called more properly magic or superstition. In the economic realm, when people are free, consumers will demand and producers obediently supply goods that we think are shoddy or in poor taste. But this is what freedom is all about. This is what freedom is all about, putting up with things we don't like and living with people we can barely stand. In short, freedom means, or free society means, standing by the processes of freedom, even though we can never endorse all the products of freedom. In order for a society to be free, a great many more people than hitherto must exhibit a much higher tolerance for individual differences and even individual eccentricity than has ever prevailed hitherto. And by eccentricity, I do not have in mind the so-called counterculture, which is really the anti-culture, which by and large is completely conformist in its deviations and quite intolerant of those who differ. It all boils down to saying that freedom does not come cheap. Freedom costs. And a people who do not know what freedom costs or who are unwilling to pay the costs of freedom will never achieve a free society nor retain such freedoms as they presently possess.